I'm Heba Elias.
And I'm Chevon Drew.
And welcome to Momentum, a Race Forward podcast, where we explore how racial justice work
is showing up everywhere around us. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Momentum, a Race Forward podcast. I am so excited that I have a guest co-host here today. This person may be familiar to some of you who have listened to the podcast from its inception, because I have a feeling that this person might have been our first guest, or maybe they were our first test guests. And I'm so excited to introduce this person. Dennis Chin, please step to the mic.
Hi, Chevon. Yeah, I remember, I think it was a test recording that we did, and I shared a little bit of my personal story. So now we're doing it for real. And I'm just really excited to have this conversation with you.
Yes. Well, I want to start by having you tell folks about your personal story, about how you joined Race Forward. It can be brief, and maybe tell us about your work here.
Yeah, thanks, Chevon. So, man, it's been a long journey. I'll start from the beginning. I'm the son of immigrants from Hong Kong. I was born and raised in New Jersey, and I currently live in Queens, New York. And I've been here for the past 15 years. And, I come to this work, racial justice work, social justice work in general, because for me, it was a way to heal. I grew up in a predominantly white middle-class suburb in New Jersey called Neshannock Station. And I experienced a lot of bullying growing up, a lot of isolation, a lot of hurt, a lot of verbal abuse because of my racial identity and because of my sexual orientation. And, at that time, I found a lot of refuge in the arts, in the creative community. And that's where I found my voice. And where I found my fire was in college. And so for me, that spark in doing racial justice work, it was reading authors like Iris Chang, Ronald Takaki, folks that have chronicled what it means to be Asian in America. I started following the work of CAV, Organizing Asian Communities in New York City, which I had the honor of serving on the board of for about 7 years. And so, just hearing about that lineage, it made me feel like I belonged for the first time in this country, and that I came from somewhere, that my experience is not new, that it's been in history, that other folks have experienced this as Asian Americans. And I was just really inspired by the work that those activists and organizers and scholars on whose shoulders I stand on, they fought against war, they fought for ethnic studies, and they fought alongside other people of color for justice and freedom in this country. And so that's the lineage that I come from. It is, as I said, ignited that fire, helped me heal from the hurt that I experienced, helped me actually understand the origins of that hurt, the root causes of that hurt. And so for me, this work is about, it feels like coming home. It feels like contributing to a movement that gave me so much, that gave me my humanity, that helped me see my humanity. And so that led me to Race Forward. Prior to Race Forward, I was at Center for Social Inclusion, and Center for Social Inclusion merged with Race Forward. And a lot of day-to-day work that I was doing was in communications. How do we talk about these issues in a way that builds power so that we can win? And I've done a lot of things, like I've done earned media, digital. I've done a little bit of narrative strategy. And in the past 4 years, because in 2016, I could not read the news one more day, I was like, I cannot do this. And so I decided to transition to doing more programmatic work. The past 4 years, I've been supporting organizations in centering racial equity. So that is a little bit of who I am. And, Chevon, I love that I'm having this conversation with you, because you and I had a chance to work together when I was the interim director of communications. I got to work with Hendel, who's the executive producer of this podcast. And so, even just this episode and guest hosting, it is another coming home for me too.
I love that. Thank you, Dennis. And it is good to have you back to chat with you and everything. Are there any thoughts you have about the growth of Momentum since you were there for our test episode when we were brand new and just trying to see how we sounded?
Yeah, I was so excited when I heard about the idea, and to see how much it's grown. I am just so proud. I remember when Hendel came up to me and was like, I have this idea. And we talked about the potential of a podcast to lift up the work that we're doing, to lift up the leadership of people like you, Chevon, and Hiba. To see this entire team build this podcast out has been amazing. And I've really enjoyed both seasons that we've had so far.
Thank you. I did not pay him to say that, but it is encouraging. Shout out to Hiba. Let's talk about the conversation that we want to open up today. There has been a wave of anti-Asian incidents across the nation, incidents of violence and harassment and abuse. It's something that's being discussed, but we have not fully discussed it on this podcast. I opened up some of that conversation with Deborah Gorman, who is the president at greenlining.org, which we had the chance to speak on our previous episode. So I was really happy to talk with her a little bit about it, especially since Deborah Gorman is Asian and Black, but we really didn't go deeply into it. So today I would love to touch on this topic more deeply with you, Dennis, and to maybe get a little more personal with you about your experience during this time, because it has been a highly stressful 2020. And now we've come into 2021. And while I think many of us have optimism and we want better, we still do have to contend with what is happening and what we want to change and what we need to understand about what is happening. So yeah, that's setting the stage for what we're going to talk about.
I'm just really thrilled to be a part of this conversation, to be another voice in centering anti-Asian racism and making sure that we are talking about it within the scope of racism in general.
To give the audience a sense of how the conversation is going to happen, we did not invite anyone else here today. So it's us two. And similar to our Black Lives Matter episode, we will be having a conversation that hopefully I will be learning from, and hopefully Dennis will also be learning from. So I want y'all to follow along and feel free to, comment back on social if there's something that stood out for you. But we will be learning, and we hope that you learn along with us. All right, so let's jump in.
Yeah, sure. Oh my gosh. So the past month, I have spent time in my apartment reading the news, doom scrolling, and the feeling that I have in my body in reaction to the violence against Asian women, Asian elders, the list goes on. I've just been numb. I'm vacillating between anger and sadness and helplessness. And I've had to compartmentalize it just to be able to walk through my neighborhood, to be able to get through the workday. And so I know I'm not the only one that's having this experience. And for me, it's just been really important to take care of myself, to allow myself to feel those feelings too, because when I compartmentalize them, doesn't mean they go away. And so for me, a practice is acknowledging it and then releasing it. And part of releasing it is being able to talk about it and to talk about my own personal experiences and to share what I think we need to do to move forward. And so something really personal happened to me at the end of February that made it really real for me. I was in Jackson Heights. It's the neighborhood right next door in Queens. I was waiting for a taxi and I was with my boyfriend. And then a man came out of his car. I'm assuming he was white, spat on the floor, walked toward me and called me first a slur used to describe gay people, and then a slur to describe Asian folks. I'm not going to repeat it here. And was making threatening gestures at me. And for anyone who knows Jackson Heights, this was shocking. I'm like, this is one of the most diverse places in this city. And for that to happen, it shook me. And I know when we talk about hate violence, it often occurs to the most marginalized people in a community, right? So when I think about the Asian American community, low-wage workers, women, trans folks, I'm here in broad daylight, able-bodied, cisgender, with another cisgender person. And this person had the gall to come up to me and say those things, right? And so, for me, it was pretty easy. My experience as a queer person in this country too, a queer person of color, I'm used to being verbally harassed. I've had that experience in my life. So it was not hard for me to flip him the bird and to say F you and to get my phone out. I took photos. I should have taken a video, but whatever. Hindsight is 2020. And I reported that incident to Stop AAPI Hate, to other national advocacy organizations tracking this, and to the New York City Commission on Human Rights. I knew that they were tracking it as well. And, there's been times where I've returned to that neighborhood, right? I've returned to that block, and I have this vindictive energy, or maybe like this energy where I wish I did something more to stand up for myself. And I think the other reason why I went there was because I'm not going to make this person make me feel scared about living and walking in my neighborhood. I belong here too. So, part of me is a little bit of like, I wish I'll see you again, because this time I'm going to take a photo and a video. But it's also for me about, no, I belong here too, and you're not going to scare me away. And so I've been processing that in the past couple of weeks, the past couple of months. And with all of that and all of the violence that's been happening, it has been weighing heavy on my heart and in my head. It's unspeakable. And yet it is happening. And it's happening to, as I said, the most marginalized people in our communities. It's heartbreaking.
I want to tell you that I'm really sorry that happened to you, first of all. And if you would join me, can we take a deep breath on that one and release together in the moment a deep breath with me?
Thanks, Chevon. I could feel my voice shaking a little bit, because just to talk about it is
Yeah. And I'm learning to take the pauses when it feels right to take the pauses. And I think probably a lot of us are learning how to try to care for ourselves moment to moment as we try to continue on, even though we see all of this violence and experience it as well. So I just wanted to make sure that you know that I definitely get what you're saying, that sounds really traumatic and upsetting, not to mention in Queens.
Yo, I am like, this person must be triggered all the time because there are hella Asian people in this neighborhood.
So thank you for sharing that and taking that breath with me. I want to talk about what happened in Atlanta. Atlanta was not the beginning of this issue. This is a long historical issue around everything from imperialism to racism as a system that really has precipitated the conditions we now see for Asian people to be getting abused in public like this and harmed and hurt or killed. But we can definitely say that Donald Trump and his consistent terminology and use of the slur, the Chinavirus, basically trying to assign blame to an entire group of people. People definitely said at that time, communications professionals said it, journalists said it, academics said it, activists said it. You cannot name a virus after a people and not expect for America, the United States, with its history, you cannot expect that people will not respond with some type of escalation of violence and some type of blame. Unfortunately, we weren't able as a country to get the previous administration to stop using that phrase to describe coronavirus. And we can see that it has escalated violence against Asians. But there's a turning point in Atlanta where the lives of multiple people were taken by someone who felt that the embodiment of his problems is somehow Asian people working at a massage parlor. The feelings that I had about this, I'm not even ready to describe, but I was ready to respond. And I know that our AAPI caucus at Race Forward were instrumental in drafting Race Forward's response to this violent white supremacist act that happened in Atlanta. And I would love to know if you feel comfortable to talk about that process and what your involvement was.
Yeah, sure. So much richness in what you shared, Chevon. I'll first respond to what you were saying about Trump, and then I'll talk about the statement. So, in my mind, Trump is very much a symptom. He's both a symptom and a cause, right? And he wasn't the only elected official person in power saying those things, calling it the Chinavirus or the Chinese flu, et cetera. And to be very clear, he used it for a reason. And this is a tactic that has been used over and over again. You say that a group of people is responsible for the conditions that we're in, right? For a particular purpose. And in this case, it was to deflect an inept response, an inept federal response to controlling the pandemic, right? So, we call this dog whistle racism. Well, in this case, it's not dog whistle. It's pretty explicit, and it's the race wedge. And so he's saying, the reason why we're in this is because of Chinese people, right? We know that he says China, but you're right. Like, folks are not going to parse out the difference. Not all Chinese people are born and raised in China. There's a diaspora, but it served a particular aim. And so for me, we have to be clear about that there was a reason for it. And Trump was really good at using that weapon, that race wedge. And so I just wanted to share that, in response to what you talked about in terms of Trump using this term. And in terms of the horror, the tragedy that happened in Atlanta, for us, for those who are Asian in Race Forward, we just felt compelled to write a statement, which you can see on our website, that reflected the multiple violences that Asian women specifically face. And so I just wanted to take a moment to name the folks that were involved in this: Michelle Kumi-Bear, Leah Obius, Emmy Yoko, Vina Kay, Tanvi Singh, Leslie Zeitler, Jeff Chang, Nico Vichiera, and myself. It was a team effort. And I remember that morning when we were thinking about responding, I remember Michelle and Leah coming in like, these are the things that we really need to talk about. Based on the nature of what happened, we have to be specific that this was a crime against Asian women, right? Who are at the intersection of multiple harmful narratives, hypersexualization trope, perpetual foreigner trope, all of those things. We need to talk about the violence that happens to Asian women in low-wage jobs. We need to talk about the ways in which US militarism, imperialism, has been at the root cause of these violence as well, and a root cause of the narratives about Asian women that we see that are so dehumanizing. And so it was a collective effort. It was a day-long effort. We were processing our grief together. And I think we produced a statement that is pretty beautiful and that actually talks about all, as I said, the multiple violences that characterize what happened in Atlanta.
We need to be able to grieve in the moment. Because like you said, if you shove things down, it doesn't mean they went anywhere. If you shove your emotions down, they're still there. So I'm glad that together you all had a chance to process what happened somewhat, because I think that I wouldn't be alone in just having felt that deep concern about like, how do we even move forward when it feels sometimes like we move forward and then we take a step back, And I feel like that is part of the process. Racial justice is not like a straight line to a destination. So I guess practicing coming together and being able to respond to things collectively, I think there's a power in that. And I feel like you all exercise that power in a way that really models for some of the rest of us at the org what can be done when we come together for like rapid response.
It felt good. It felt good to be together and to produce something. And it was, at least for me, healing. I needed to do that in that moment. Another reason why we wanted to put out a statement too, Race Forward, we're a multiracial organization. And so for us, we're also thinking about what does multiracial solidarity look like in this moment, even in this instance where Asian women were specifically targeted. And I say that because what we knew was going to happen and what we're seeing now is that in response to this, what happens is a call for increased policing. And so for us, as Asian folks working in racial justice, we really wanted to put the spotlight on the root causes of this hate and violence. And for us, that's white supremacy, right? White supremacy has shaped the conditions in which hate and violence is allowed to thrive. And so, we wanted to be ahead of it, right? Like other organizations, Asian-led and serving organizations like Advancing Justice in Atlanta, CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, the Oakland Chinatown Coalition. There's so many orgs that made sure that we put the spotlight on white supremacy, right? Instead of making it a this race against this race issue, Black versus Asian, white versus Asian, et cetera. We really wanted to come ahead of that.
Yes. And in the statement that you all put together, I really appreciated how explicit you were about the harms that have been compounded by white supremacy over time and how those harms could come together to harm some of the most vulnerable, including people who are perhaps without documentation can be in that group, people who are working in low-wage jobs, people who are working in sex work jobs. Like whether we know all of the details, we can see some of the intersections from a bird's eye view. And I feel like the statement was so explicit in acknowledging all of it that it made it that much more powerful, because it's almost like an educational tool now that lives on our site where people can go back and reference it. And I love what you said about your concern regarding the response that some folks would immediately go to, hey, we need to send in more police. And I actually did see that. I saw some of that on social media where, you know, the NYPD, I think, was going to send more police into certain neighborhoods.
Yeah, plain clothes officers.
Into certain Asian communities in New York. And for me, I had a physical response, my body had a physical reaction to that, because I remember reading about a woman in Queens. She worked at a Queens massage parlor. I don't even know if I can say it. Okay, let's put it this way. The NYPD is known to run sting operations, their words, not mine, on massage parlors in Queens where Asians work. And the thing is if you're not in a position of power, sometimes what's happening is if police show up, not everything is on the up and up. People have have reported that they've been intimidated by police, or they've been intimidated into sex acts by police or undercover detectives. And in this actual instance, a woman died. She literally fell out a window, and she was in such fear and terror of this NYPD sting that was going on. She lost her life. I think people should look the story up. Can you spell her name, Dennis? Because I think it's important for people to know.
Yes, Yang and SONG. And there's an organization that has done a lot of advocacy on this in New York City, and it's called Red Canary Song. And so, what an illustration of the multiple intersections of violence that these women face day to day. And, this choice of you're either unsafe or you call the police. It is a preposterous choice. It is a false choice, right? And in the times that we're in, these are the choices that are before us for a lot of people. And this choice was designed. For me, that's just so important, right? And, we know that more policing, it's not going to solve the problem of hate and violence. Oftentimes, police are responding to acts of hate and violence after they've occurred. And we also know from decades, if not centuries of evidence, that police cause direct harm to Black and Brown communities and members of the Southeast Asian community as well. So, it's such a fraught choice. And, when I say that, many of my peers have said, well, then what do we do to get at the root cause of this problem? We have said we need to address white supremacy. And I completely agree. And I also know that can be, for folks who don't do this work day to day, I even think about my parents, right? How could I actually explain that to them? In this instance, for the shooter in Atlanta, he was white, but we're also seeing violence perpetrated by people of other races as well. And again, the root is still white supremacy. And, as I said earlier, we are saying that hate and violence don't just occur out of thin air. I don't believe that people just have evil in their hearts. I think people are socialized to believe certain things because of narratives. I think that people are in scarcity or anxiety because of the policies that we have created in this country. And so when we say white supremacy is at the root of this hate and violence, we are saying that white supremacy is at the root of the narratives that dehumanize people of color, and in this case, particularly Asian Americans, by characterizing us as folks that don't belong here, perpetual foreigner. For women, hypersexual objects, sexual objects, that we're not going to fight back. So many harmful narratives that flatten us. The one narrative that we are all monolithic, that we are all the same. And some of this might sound familiar to folks of different racial groups too, because they're similar, right?
That you're all doing well. You're all rich in America if you've come here.
Yeah,
right?
That's the model minority myth. And that actually justifies the conditions that have created this hate violence, And so it's complicated. And when we say white supremacy, that's also an impetus for people of all races to come together, right? To actually dismantle white supremacy and to build a society where everyone feels valued, where everyone is free. That is what's required for us to address hate at its root. And that's a long-term project. But what we're saying is that more police is not going to actually address those root causes. it's not going to actually address the manifestations of harm that are coming up. It's not even the only harm that's happening in our community, this harm at an individual level. It also happens at a systemic level too, right? And so what we're saying is that this connects all of our struggles together. And I'm hearing from peers of mine who are also working in Asian American led and serving organizations that we need to keep our focus on this.
Yes. I'm sorry I wasn't able to speak to that without such a pause, but it just...
Yeah. It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. It's complicated.
Just to see that, like, oh, we're going to send more police to Queens and to all these areas. It was really upsetting. So with that, I wonder if it's okay if I read a little bit about Song Yang, because I think part of dispelling these myths and giving people more like room to come together is to actually like lift up the intersection of where the harm is happening systemically so that we don't flatten out people's stories. And folks can look this up further. So this is your warning that this may be slightly upsetting, right? But I'm going to read. This is from the New York Times. Song Yang had come with her much older husband to Flushing in 2013 after an economic downturn in Saipan forced them to close the 2 restaurants they owned there. With her husband unable to work, she had to scramble to find a job. Before long, she was offering sex for money on 40th Road, a dangerously vulnerable job. She had been beaten, robbed, and sexually assaulted. She was also arrested a few times, which she feared might thwart her chances to secure legal residence in the U.S. Arrested again in late September 2017, Song Yang became despondent. Quote, "I've fallen so low, I can't be saved," she wrote in a WeChat message to a lawyer that had been trying to help her. Quote, "Without purpose, what direction, what meaning is there to keep on living?" So the reason I wanted to read that excerpt is because what Dennis is talking about is the layers upon layers of harm that systemic racism is actually inflicting on people are much more the same than they are different. In that small excerpt, you can hear that someone left where they're from for economic reasons, right? We mentioned earlier, imperialism can cause people as well to leave places that they're from to come here after the place they're from has been economically ruined, struggling to find a job. This is something universal that a lot of people can relate to this. Getting into sex work, being abused in sex work, and then also facing arrest. So now you're actually in the system in a negative way. Your name is coming up in the system. And if anyone knows how that works, once you're in there one time, that is the impetus for them to continue to come find you, right? Like to continue to arrest you because you're red flagged. And then actually internalizing that feeling of being othered, of being isolated, of feeling like you're not even a person anymore, and verbalizing that even as people are trying to help you. Like it's very deep and there's a lot that goes on. And I think the immigration piece is also important, that the more interaction people have with police, the scarier it can get for people who are in a vulnerable position. So I want to thank you. I feel like the statement went into this in more detail. I want to encourage everyone to hit up the raceforward.org website. Thank you for the opportunity to read that excerpt. Dennis, I was looking up the history of Asian people in America. And I know Jeff Chang actually was involved in I think it was a PBS documentary about Asians in America. But I also was looking up, just kind of trying to find articles to see like who were some of the earlier Asians that came to America, came to the US. And I learned about someone who was brought here at, I think, 14 and was named, quote unquote, the Chinese lady, and was put in what amounts to a zoo situation for 50 cents a view in 1834. This person's name was Afong Moy, Afongmoy, and they were brought from China to New York. And you could pay to essentially gawk at this person. And this is one of the earlier known moments in which an Asian person, or at least an Asian female, had been brought to the United States. I wonder if you can speak to some of the history of Asians in America, because I think it sets up some of the dehumanization that we see now.
Yeah, that's a huge question, Chevon. You know, there's the history of Asians in America is long and complex. And every generation, I feel like we are redefining what Asian America is because of immigration, right? There's always a new wave of immigrants coming in. And so we always return to this question, who is Asian America? And there's a long tapestry of struggle, of resistance, of victory, of solidarity in this country's history. And so There's a host of immigration policies that have discriminated against Asian people, labor laws. We talked about US imperialism and militarism abroad. I would say economic policy at home and abroad too. I think about ICE raids that are happening, not only impacting the Latinx community, but particularly Southeast Asians in this country who are undocumented. I think about the experience of Arab, Muslim, Middle Eastern, South Asian, Sikh folks post 9/11. And in fact, what I experienced in Jackson Heights, my partner is Indo-Caribbean. He was like, it was very similar to what I experienced post 9/11. And so we have all of this history. We as Asian Americans, targets of both racism at an individual level and at a systemic level. And so some of the policies that I've talked about that have targeted Asian people, they have targeted other folks too, right? And this is why I keep on returning to the statement that white supremacy is at the root of all of these things. And so this was my politicization. This was my coming to understand my positionality as an Asian American in this country, is that, we've had really direct experiences of racism, of oppression, and it is also part of a larger pattern of systemic racism in this country in a way that hoarded power and resources for white folks. And, for me, are the institutions that govern our lives, the day-to-day decisions that impact how much money you get, where you're able to buy food, where you're able to get a house. All of that has been shaped by this ideology of white supremacy. And we'll just say that, especially in times like this, in a pandemic that we're in right now, it has exacerbated the economic inequities that we see. And instead of pointing the finger at white supremacy, as it should, we instead just blame other folks, right? It's, in this case, Asian people that's to blame for the economic anxiety that you're experiencing in this pandemic. The fact that you lost your job, the fact that you got sick, instead of, again, interrogating the root causes of why we are in these conditions in the first place. So all that to say is that it's interconnected. And I think for me, being Asian, the complexity of how we are positioned racially in this country, I've come to understand that complexity and to see that nuance. And we're going to have to do that, especially if we think about building a multiracial movement for racial justice, that this stuff is complicated. We're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about people having multiple identities. And so to be able to find the commonality within it, to be able to see what is at the root that's causing all of us to experience violence on both the individual level and the systemic level, we have to collectively put our attention on that, right? Instead of the usual thing that we do, blame, shame, guilt, grievance, pointing at fingers at other racial groups. No, these conditions were created. We are not the enemy. You are not my enemy, right? But the system is. The system that's created this hate violence is. And so, for me, that's where we need to go. And I know there are so many brilliant organizers and activists in the Asian American community who have been doing this work day in and day out, calling in our people to look at the root causes. So I'll leave it at that.
You're bringing us to an interesting point. So you talked about the complexity of how Asians are positioned in America, right? So even just saying Asians in America, that's very broad. You mentioned Asians from very different regions and how they still can be scapegoated as the other when white supremacy thinks it's convenient. So I appreciated that. And you talked about how if we are to build a multiracial movement, we will need to find common ground and talk about all this complexity of what's causing all of us to experience conditions that have us scrambling for what's left over, at the bottom of the ladder of white supremacy. And I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this conversation that I've been having with some of my folks. It's about the interpersonal part, because you juxtapose the interpersonal with the overarching systemic reasons for why some of us are scrambling for resources all the time. And I would love to talk about people who tell me that their interpersonal experiences, I'm talking about Black people right now that I spoke to about how they're feeling in this moment. And a number of them, they felt emotional about experiences that they've had whether in professional spaces or in their neighborhoods, where they have not felt like they were in community with some of the Asians that they may be locally situated with, but they did not feel that they were actually in community. So for example, working in a corporate space and feeling like if you call upon your Asian coworker, that they're not on your side because they are more so aligning themselves with power in the workplace. And if the powerful people in your workplace are the whiter people in your workplace, some of these folks I spoke with were like, how can I be expected to join into movement that is centered around all of us as people of color, when in my day-to-day experiences, I feel like I am marginalized as a Black person, even within people of color, that I cannot get that same type of help, but that people will call upon me if it's time to help others. And I wonder what you think about those types of interpersonal experiences and like what your response would be to folks who are having those feelings come up.
That's real. I can imagine that there were many situations in which, people who are Black have, they've had experiences with Asian folks where Asian folks were complicit with the white power system in an institution. I don't mean KKK white power system, although there are probably instances of that, but even in an institutional setting, right? Like siding with power. And so that's real. And I also think for me, when I talk to other Asian folks about even having this conversation around how Asian folks are positioned, our relationship to the Black community and to the white community as well, I think it's really important to be specific about racism. I think for Asian folks, a lot of, especially in the past year, so many instances of racism at the individual level, interpersonal level, verbal epithets, violence, physical violence, etc. And that's real. Asian folks also experience institutional racism as well, the ways in which policies can unintentionally exclude Asian folks. Like, so for example, when policies, I would say like a city putting out notices that aren't in different Asian languages, right? And at the same time, for me, it's important for other Asian folks to know that the racism in America, the very institutions that govern our society, from when I think about government, I think about philanthropy, I think about all of these other sectors, right? All of our companies too. The way our very society has been constructed is on anti-Blackness, structural racism that was targeted specifically at Black people. That is the reason why our neighborhoods look the way that they are. That is the reason why our schools and our school system is the way that it looks like. That is the reason why our healthcare system looks the way it looks like. It is because specifically of structural racism against Black folks. This does not mean that the pain that we experience as Asian Americans is no less real, right? But the pain that we experience is different. It's different and connected to the pain that Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks in this country experience. It's not a coincidence that we have communities, Black communities, and some Asian communities, I think Korean, Chinese, Filipino, Southeast Asian communities that are in the same neighborhood. When I think about low-income families, low-wealth families. And to be clear, there's a reason why these neighborhoods are racially concentrated. Right? It's because of segregation. It's because of institutional policies that created those neighborhoods, that cited those neighborhoods together. I think about Chinatowns too. Those weren't just created because, just Chinese people wanted to be together. It was because society, institutions, they were facing discrimination on a whole host of fronts, both on the individual level and institutional level. And so they had to create these ethnic enclaves. We have to remember that even the neighborhoods where we do see that conflict happening, even those neighborhoods and the conditions of those neighborhoods, again, they were shaped, right? When we say like white supremacy is at the root, white supremacy is the ideology that's created the winners take all economic state in which we're in which we just have a handful of people controlling just the amount of wealth that the rest of us have. And so, all of us, but particularly Black, Latinx, Indigenous people, have experienced economic precarity for a while, and white folks too. And so we have this scarcity, we have this economic anxiety And so instead of looking at the policies that created those conditions, why we're in those neighborhoods together, why you lost your job, why a pandemic was able to completely decimate our economy in the first place, where our government wasn't protecting us in the way that it should, that it had in other countries, we're not putting our attention on that. Instead, it's Chinese people's faults. And that's the reason why my housing situation is the way I can't pay rent, right? Why I lost my job, all of those things. And this crisis exacerbated those tensions already. And again, we've seen this happen in history. I think about Vincent Chin at that time in the 1980s when, the auto industry was facing global competition. And so Vincent Chin became the symbol of Asian takeover. And he was killed by two white men in 1982, I believe. And so there's a scapegoating that happens, that's allowed to happen because of both the dehumanization that's created by narratives about Asian people, and then also compounded by the policies and practices that created these conditions, these economic precarious conditions. And so, for me, that's such a complex story to tell, but it's the one that we're going to have to lift up if we're going to find our way out of this. There's no easy solution to addressing this hate violence. There is no easy solution because the roots, they run deep. They run deep. And we have to be so crystal clear that systemic racism and white supremacy is at the root of it. And, if there's one thing that I want folks to take away is for folks to ask what has created the conditions in which this hate violence has been allowed to grow. And there's policy behind it, there's institutional practice behind it, and there's narrative and culture behind it. The history and reality of those things that created this tinderbox where at this moment, Asian people perceived to be Chinese, are being scapegoated and targeted. And we are not alone in having this experience. Black people have also been scapegoated for a very long time. Immigrants from Mexico, from South America have been scapegoated, have been used as wedges to shrink the commons, to shrink government's role in correcting the wrongs that it has incurred in history. It's not the fault of society. It's those people's faults, right? And we have those narratives happening all the time. And when I say policy, institutions, and narrative, that's how, for me, this is why I've been at Race Forward, because those are some of the pillars which we tackle. We know that it's because policy has been racist. We know because institutions have been racist and narratives have been racist that we actually need to intervene in all of those three things and grow power, particularly the power of Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American Pacific Islanders to actually transform society in a way that centers dignity, compassion, equity, and justice for everyone. That's the vision.
And I encourage people when I get into conversations around that type of class solidarity, race solidarity, all of that, I encourage folks to do some research. It doesn't mean that what they're experiencing may not be real. That's not what I'm saying. I'm typically encouraging them to do research to understand the roots of why you may come into contact with someone that you would hope would treat you like an ally where you are institutionally, and you feel like they are instead aligning themselves with power or with whiteness. I encourage folks to actually look up why we feel like we're even on this rung of whiteness, of how can you get closer to that type of power. If you notice the rung, it's not your imagination, but I encourage folks to do that research as to why are people trying to align themselves closer to that in some instances. And what you talked about with the manufactured scarcity, for me, that's a big part of how systemic racism works so well, is that when there's power hoarding at the top, then the rest of us have to kind of scramble for what's left. And people will sometimes take whatever position they think on the ladder of white supremacy will help them to survive, will help them to do better. So it can be a reality people are experiencing, but two things can be true at the same time. You can have experienced that interpersonally, but also there can be a larger systemic picture that literally was created in large part by the government here. So for example, the scapegoating you talked about, we can say Asian Americans and Asian presenting folks at this moment, but I recall narratives around Mexicans years ago where it was like, okay, Mexicans are taking jobs from Black people because they're working for less than they should. And the larger issue that I was interested in researching was, well, why would someone come here to take a job that pays less than it should? or is paying off the books or is putting them at risk more because they're, doing something that they should be doing with safety gear, but they're not giving them the safety gear and they're still doing the job. Like, I'm just making up scenarios here. And what I was learning about is just this idea of giving people incentive to come here to do labor that will build the country up. But then when they're not convenient to have here anymore, the system will scapegoat them as a problem. And I feel like that happens with various groups of like immigrants, that if they come to do a specific type of labor, sometimes people don't think about the immigration law or the labor laws that are creating these types of competitive conditions, when there's actually enough for everyone to be paid well or be treated well. And there's room for us to change immigration law so that we're not othering people. But that's not what has happened. So then the day-to-day level can feel like a really big competition.
It's like, the conversation then becomes like us versus them, right? And I get it, because racial capitalism does create scarcity. These are the choices before us. And these choices didn't just naturally occur. So like Rinku Sen in her book, The Accidental American, I don't think I have the exact quote, but I do remember this phrase, particularly when it comes to immigration and Black and Brown solidarity, is that, we've had a free flow of capital, but not the free flow of labor. And for me, I just want to lift that up because, when we talk about, even in those instances, immigrants, quote unquote, taking jobs at lower pay, the tendency is to blame immigrants for surviving, right? And surviving because of bad economic policy, to say the least, that created the conditions in which they had to migrate, right? i.e. NAFTA, cough, cough, right? And what happens is that we don't focus on the ways in which corporations have created these conditions, right? So I said free flow of capital. Corporations have been able to become multinationals. And so they go to these other places, create harm. And then what happens is that immigration comes as a result of that, right? We don't namely interrogate that enough as one of the root causes of migration.
Yeah. And empire too. I think about how many people now, even if you think about across the water in the UK, they are deporting Jamaicans that have been there since they were young, that don't even know where papers are or have any papers at this point, because they told them to come there to work decades ago and wanted them to do certain types of labor. But now the government is like, okay, we don't need you here anymore. So even though you're 60, you've never lived in the island of Jamaica for so long, if you can't show us some papers, you got to go, right? So they were useful before, but not useful now. And so I really am glad that we talked about some of the systemic and legal reasons for why some of this competition exists. And I hope folks will do some of that research as well to dig into it. So thank you, Dennis, for everything that you just shared. I wonder if we can transition over to talk about some of the work that grassroots organizers are doing on the ground in their local cities to help advance justice for Asian Americans and all the subgroups therein.
Yeah, I think that there are many, and many of them are led by Asian women. So I think about the work of CAV, Organizing Asian Communities, that have been laser focused on systemic racism by organizing low-income Asian immigrants and refugees. I think about the Oakland Chinatown Coalition that have been figuring out ways to increase community-led safety efforts. There's Advancing Justice, particularly in Atlanta, that have advocated for low-wage workers, like the ones that were killed. And there are just so many more across this country. And I think, for me, these organizations have been laser focused on the root cause of this hate violence, which is white supremacy. And they have, for years, have been organizing folks, particularly in the Asian community, to join in this fight, right? I think Freedom Inc. is another one in the Midwest. It's another organization that I look up to as well, that are, again, addressing the root causes of this violence. Other things that I think are worth mentioning is, we're seeing a lot of the proliferation of community-led safety efforts. I named one that happened with the Oakland Chinatown Coalition, but even here in New York City, we've seen some volunteer-driven safety efforts. So Safe Walks New York City volunteers will walk with you if you request it. And, for me, it's like we're also seeing a lot of bystander intervention training. I think Hollaback has been doing that. They've been doing this for many years. And I know that many different organizations have been calling on them to do some upstander intervention training. And that's really good, because for me, when I think about what happened in Jackson Heights, I was also, it was in the middle of the day. There were people there. And I just wish that it wasn't just me and my partner there in that situation, that someone else could have backed me up. And I also think about the woman that was assaulted in Midtown Manhattan the other day. Someone did actually intervene. It was across the street. It wasn't in that video, but we also saw, no one in the immediate vicinity did anything. We saw a security guard actually close the door on them. And so, for me, knowing that a community has got your back, that for me is safety, that folks are looking out for my safety. And so I've worked with some local government institutions, and I know that we've seen some, whether it's government or any other source of funds, actually resourcing this alternative, building it out. I want to see more of that. Right? Because, even when I just talked about Safe Walks New York City, I know that they have right now been subsisting on personal donations. But what if there were actual institutions that were resourcing it, where we could create true safety, where we didn't have to rely on cops and undercover cops to be able to respond to these situations? And so for me, I would want to see a lot more resources on that, more resources to community-based organizations like the ones that I just named, because they are organizing folks in this country, other Asian folks, and talking about the things that you and I just talked about, and in languages that they understand. For me, I can speak a little bit of Cantonese, but I am not fluent. But I know that there are a lot of folks in these organizations that speak multiple Asian languages and are calling people in. And, another piece of this is addressing these narratives, these dehumanizing narratives. I'm interested in how do we build the narrative infrastructure and narrative power for Asian people to tell stories that reflect our humanity, that we belong, And for me, that's the work of artists, of creatives and culture makers to be able to push back on these narratives that have caused this hate and violence to occur. And so I want to see more of that too. And then I think, the last thing I'll say too, and I've learned this, supporting organizers, organizing myself in queer and Asian communities. I think, this is a moment where I just shared how I'm feeling in this moment, right? I'm feeling a little bit of fear, frustration, and anger. And for other Asian organizers and activists who want to use this as a way to mobilize more folks to address the root causes of this hate and violence, I think it's just so important for us to be able to acknowledge it. The way that you did with me, Chevon, right? To be like, I see the pain that you're going through. And, there's just been this undercurrent, being Asian American in this country, this liminal space that we're in, right? Where our issues are not seen as important or part of the conversation about racism. And this is not to say that we should be at the center of that conversation, but we should be a part of it, right? And so for me, calling other Asian folks, my parents' friends, people who live in New York City, who may not speak the same language that we have been using, Chevon, in this conversation, we need to acknowledge their pain because people are feeling that no one cares, right? And as I said, a woman was assaulted in broad daylight, and it seemed that no one cared. No one cared. That is how other Asian folks feel in this. I'll just speak for myself. That's how I feel right now, in a broad sense. I think in pockets, I am lucky to have a community where I feel seen, right? But I would say, like in the national narrative, not so much. And so, for us to be able to see Asian people as full human beings, and for people who are interested in organizing Asian communities to join us in our fight against systemic racism, to address hate and violence, that we do need to acknowledge that pain, the particular experience of being Asian American in this country. And that in doing that, it actually surfaces lessons in solidarity. It surfaces lessons in how we can transform conditions that impact us all, right? Where we can actually create abundance for everyone. For me, living in this country, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not winners and losers. That is the choice that was given to us. We inherited this system, and that system was rooted in white supremacy ideology, winners versus losers, individualism, all of those things. There is liberation on the other side of that. And it might feel like loss in the immediate term, but I promise you that when we get to that other side, even if we don't ourselves, future generations, your children, will live in a more just world where they can be their full selves, where they can be seen in their full humanity, where we're not blaming the problems in our society on other groups of people and because of how, quote unquote, they are, but we're actually looking at the root causes, policies, institutions, and narratives that are fueling these incidences, these tragedies, this horror, right? And that is the work that we need to do together. And there's room for everybody. there's room for everybody in this fight.
I'm happy because I agree that there's room for everyone in the fight. And I'm so glad you mentioned that people need to have their feelings acknowledged about what they have gone through. White supremacy can make people feel very isolated in their struggle. And that's part of how it functions so that people don't come together to actually eradicate it. So sometimes I think when folks express to me that they feel isolated, I try to encourage them to try to do some of that deep work where you figure out how does your struggle mirror the struggle of other people of color. I want to thank all of our listeners. Dennis will continue on as guest host for the next few episodes while Hiba is on sabbatical.
Yay! Again, it's an honor to just be Asian, Sandra Oh. But I was really nervous doing this and being able to have this conversation with you, Chevon, someone that I've worked with for a number of years. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm just really excited about guest hosting with you.
Well, everyone, you can visit raceforward.org for all the latest updates, as well as the statement that we kept referring to today. You can also check us out on social media. We have Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at RaceForward. And I encourage you to rate and subscribe to the podcast. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and now we are on Pandora. So please remember that as well. I want to thank everyone for tuning in and wish you a safe week ahead. Say bye, Dennis.
Bye.